We want to understand what matters to Albertans and why they often feel alienated from the rest of Canada. Tonight, we're going to hear about populism. Theoretically, all grassroots causes that challenge the status quo, whether they are from the left, center, or right, can be considered populism. But in today's heated discourse, the term populism has a very specific meaning. Tonight's speaker, Preston Manning, will help us understand the roots of this political movement. After his presentation, author and former CBC documentarian Karen Wells will sit down with Preston to explore his comments. Then we will open the floor to your questions. So let me now give you a brief background on our speaker. Preston Manning served as a Member of Parliament from 1993 to 2002. He founded two new political parties, the Reform Party of Canada and the Canadian Reform Conservative Alliance, both of which became the official opposition in the Canadian Parliament and laid the foundation for the new Conservative Party of Canada. Mr. Manning served as leader of the opposition from 1997 to 2000 and was also his party's science and technology critic. In 2007, he was made a Companion of the Order of Canada, and in 2013, he was appointed to the Privy Council. Upon his retirement from elected office, Mr. Manning founded the Manning Centre for Building Democracy, now known as Canada Strong and Free. The purpose of this organization is to strengthen democracy and the conservative movement in Canada. Mr. Manning graduated from the University of Alberta with a BA in economics and was a consultant to the energy industry for 20 years before he entered politics. He has received honorary degrees from the University of Calgary, University of Alberta, Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, Tyndall University College, York University, and the University of Toronto. Preston and his wife Sandra divide their time between Calgary, Vancouver, and a family ranching operation in central Saskatchewan. Just days ago, he returned from a long-awaited visit with grandchildren in Australia. Please join me in welcoming Preston Manning.
For that, I'll get my notes here. Well, I'd like to just first of all say thank you very much for the kind introduction and just the opportunity to visit with you, and the Northumberland Learning Connection for making this effort to help one region of the country understand the other regions. In fact, I think you should franchise the concept, because I think one of these in each, this country's badly divided right now, and these kind of exercises are helpful to uniting it. So congratulations, Dorothy, and to your group, and congratulations to you people for being supportive of by coming out. And I've been asked to talk about the subject of populism, which is in the news today in Canada and the United States. It's become a fairly popular topic. And I might start with a definition. This isn't a very sophisticated definition, but populism generally refers to these bottom-up grassroots political movement, whereby large numbers of ordinary rank and file people become disillusioned with the political leadership, with political institutions, political parties, and start to demonstrate their disillusionment by forming organizations, by holding rallies, by holding meetings, and often by presenting alternatives to whatever the status quo is offering. In terms of Western Canada, I think it's important to understand that populism is to the political culture of Western Canada, particularly Alberta, what soft nationalism is in Quebec. It is an integral part of the political culture. So if you want to understand the politics of the West, you got to understand populism. I could get diverted on a number of subjects here, but if you think both the West and Quebec have these third-party traditions, in Quebec, the Bloc Populaire, the Union Nationale, the Ralliement Démocratique, the PQ, the BQ, the ADQ, we've got all these third parties. And what's at the root of those? Every one of those has this soft nationalism as part of its program. Well, the West has a third-party tradition too. The old progressive, the Farmers' Party, the United Farmers of Alberta, the United Farmers of Manitoba, the depression parties of the CCF, the Social Credit Reform, the long list. And at the bottom of that is this populist sentiment. It's part of the political culture. So by making an effort to understand populism, you're really making an effort to understand kind of the root, one of the root parts of the Western culture. Now, I might make reference to the fact that populism is not just confined to Western Canada. The Antigonish movement in the Maritimes was a populist movement. This I mentioned soft nationalism in Quebec is a populist movement. The Doug Ford and Rob Ford phenomena here in Ontario has populist elements to it. So it's not, that phenomenon is not just confined to the West, but I think I'm safe to say from a historic standpoint that no portion of North America has had more experience with populist movements, populist parties, and populist governments than Western Canada. And I've sort of gone through the examples of them, but I'll mention them again. The farmers' movement, the progressive movement was this is in the 20th century. They actually formed a government here in Ontario. The United Farmers of Ontario formed a government in 1919 to 1923. E.C. Drury was the premier then. But then there was the formal farmers' parties. This is agrarian populism, but United Farmers of Alberta, United Farmers of Saskatchewan, United Farmers of Manitoba, and so forth. Then there was the depression parties of the CCF, the Canadian Commonwealth Federation, and Social Credit, both produced in the West. These are populist parties produced by the Depression. And then more recently, there was the Reform Party from in the late 1980s and 1990s. And one of the things I'm going to suggest to you is that there are elements of this freedom convoy and some of the other things that are around that has this populist tinge too. I'll maybe touch on that a little later. Now, I thought something that would be helpful to you here would be to look at some of the significant characteristics of these populist things. And then maybe the first one is that they start very small. They often start very small so that the general public don't even know they exist. They can start small, but they can grow. And I had a high school teacher once. It's funny how you remember teachers that actually taught you something. He stopped me on the football field, and he said, well, what does it mean to be intelligent? What is intelligence? And you know, I'm a kid, I said, well, it means being smart or something. He says it's the ability to recognize that which is significant. And I think there's a sense of that in this political arena too, the ability to recognize what's significant. But these populist things often start so small with such a small number of people that nobody recognizes them as being significant at all. The Reform Party started in the late 1980s. There was disillusionment with the Federal Liberal Party because of the National Energy Program. It transferred $100 billion worth of wealth out of the West to the Central Treasury and to the consuming provinces. There was disillusionment with the Conservatives because of the old CF-18 issue where they transferred a $100 million contract that had been won by Bristol Aircraft in Winnipeg and took it for political reasons to Quebec. So people were mad at both parties. But Reform started with just 5 people meeting in a boardroom in Calgary and said, we're not happy with the political options. What are we going to do about it? And we couldn't even agree on what we're going to do about it. We said, well, this is very typically Canadian. Let's have a meeting, we'll have a conference and hash it out. But my main point here is that these things start small and they may have the potential to grow. A second characteristic is usually these things are either ignored by the establishment of the day or the more traditional parties, or they're seen as a threat and are disparaged. So very often then the first inklings that the general public get about these things are either they're being told that this is insignificant, don't pay any attention, why would you even want to find out about this? Or they get pretty negative messages, these guys are a threat, these people are a problem. So often these populist movements start out with a pretty bad image. They're either something to be forgotten or something to be disparaged. Reform contested the 1988 election. This is the first election. We ran 72 candidates only in Western ridings. So though Reform was set up as a national party, it was not set up as a regional party. And we finished second in 12 seats, but we didn't elect anybody. And that night on the CBC commentary, the commentators spent about 2 minutes on this, and this is just a flash in the pan, don't even worry about it or think about it. They also said somewhat similar things about the Bloc Québécois in Quebec. One election later, 1993, those two parties held 106 seats, or a third of the seats in the parliament. Not a single pollster predicted that would happen, not a single one, up to 2 months before the 1993 election. So I think while these things are ignored and even disparaged at the front end, it's important to recognize sometimes they are significant, and we ought to pay attention to them. Maybe the third thing I'll touch on is these populist movements have their wild and woolly side to them. They're often stimulated by emotion. I mentioned Reform. People were angry, not just disagreeing with some policy. They were angry. You take $100 billion away from people and they're going to get angry. You take a contract that meant a huge amount to Winnipeg and you take it away for political reasons, they're going to be mad. So these populist movements have an emotional and anger part to it, which can make them quite ugly. People say things that they say in anger that they shouldn't say, do things that they do in anger. So one of the challenges is how do you deal with the wild side of these populist movements? And we've had some experience with that. In the oil patch, there's such a concept as the wildcat well that's drilled into a formation where you don't know what's down below. And then there's such a thing as a rogue well, which hits a reservoir of gas or oil that's under such enormous pressure that when you hit it, it blows the drilling platform off the wellhead. It can catch fire. It's extremely dangerous. Enormous amount of energy there, but it's out of control. Catch fire. In Alberta, when the Leduc figure was discovered in 1948, a well called Atlantic No. 3 blew just south of Edmonton. In 3 days, it pumped more oil out into the atmosphere. It caught fire. It pumped 10 times the amount of oil that came out of the Exxon Valdez. These things, they're frightening. So how do you deal with a rogue well, which is kind of like the wild and woolly side of populism? Well, one way of dealing with it in the oil patch is you drill in a relief well from the side. And the angle got to be right. If it's too shallow, it won't take off enough pressure. If it's too deep, it can turn into a rogue well. But if it's just right, it can take off enough pressure, the valves can be installed, and you can start to harness this enormous energy. And in many respects, Reform, and these farmers' parties as well, they were actually relief well activities. We drilled, there was a lot of anger in the West. There was secession. A secessionist elected a separatist to the Alberta legislature. The overtures from the American embassy or the consulate, do you guys want to be the 51st state? This is, dangerous stuff. But and Reform had to identify with it. You had to plug into the well. You had to say, we're angry too. We agree this was all this bad. But instead of blowing the country up or seceding or something, why don't we do this, and this? And so there's the wild and woolly side, and whether it becomes a real problem or not very much depends on whether the leadership or even the other political parties, have any ideas to what to actually do about it. Now, so I've touched on the negatives. Oh, one other thing on and this is not well understood. One of the other things that can moderate these the wild and woolly side of these populist movements is its own membership. Sometimes the membership, the rank and file people, are not as wild as some of the leadership that are, particularly the ideological leadership. And in Saskatchewan, for example, the CCF was a democratic socialist party that was supported by the rank and file people of Saskatchewan. It was elected. Tommy Douglas was the longtime premier there. There were people connected to the upper echelons of that party, particularly intellectuals, who really were doctrinaire socialists, who believed that the state should own the means of production. And they started to state the state should own the means of production in Saskatchewan, which means the state should own the land. Well, those guys started to talk like that, and the way those ordinary farmers in Saskatchewan said, wait a minute, like, we supported you because of your social positions and a lot of other things, but if you start talking like that, you will not be the government here for more than 6 months. In other words, the rank and file moderated some of the ideological extremism of the party. And the same thing happened in Alberta. The Social Credit Party started in the Depression. Alberta was flat on its back. The only industry it had was agriculture, was just flat on its back. The net income of, the gross income of Alberta dropped by 50%. You've seen the angst that's created when our economy contracts by 1 or 2%. Can you imagine contracted by 50%? And the social credit idea was an idea that you could stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply up to the point where it wasn't inflationary. It was not unlike the current new monetary theory. And they got elected on this social credit idea, the provinces in this huge depression. But there were ideologues connected with that party that insisted that that was the only thing you talked about. There was monetary reform, monetary reform. It wasn't even an area of provincial jurisdiction. And after a while, the rank and file members of the party said, wait a minute. That for one thing, that's in federal jurisdiction. The depression came over. If you keep hammering away on that plank, you're not going to last 6 months. And so the rank and file moderated an excess of some of the leadership. And so I really suggest there's two ways of handling that wild and woolly side. One is that relief well concept, but the other is that there's a lot of common sense among ordinary people, even when they join these populist things, and they can sometimes put the brakes on the wilder elements at the top. Anyway, I've spent much too much time on that. So we talked about the wild and woolly side, but there's a positive side. Or if you ask the question, is there a positive side to these populist movements? Do they contribute anything? And the historical answer, not just my answer, is yes. And there's no better illustrations of that than from Western Canada. So let's take some of the positive results. Who was the first woman to be elected to the federal parliament in a time when women were never elected? She didn't get there through the Liberals. She didn't get through there the Conservatives. Her name was Agnes Campbell MacPhail, elected in 1921, and she came up with one of those progressive farmers' parties. In fact, the Liberals did everything they could to knock her out. Eventually, they did knock her out of the parliament. First woman, and women's involvement as elected people came up through a populist movement. The first woman to be elected to a legislature anywhere in the British Empire was Louise McKinney, elected in 1917 in Alberta. And the organization that she ran for was called the Non-Partisan League. It wasn't even a party, it was a populist advocacy group. So this is a very positive development. Women getting elected came up through the populist parties. The second aspect of this was, some of you will recall, in 1928, there was this famous, it's called the Persons Case. The Constitution of Canada says the government can appoint persons to the Senate of Canada. And an argument developed, are women persons? This sounds pretty, you're going to start throwing stuff at me if I stay on that theme too long. But does the law say that they are persons? That's what the argument was about. And this case was put to the Supreme Court of Canada, are women persons in Canadian law? And the Supreme Court of Canada in 1928 said, no, they're not persons. And incidentally, that Supreme Court was composed of 5 justices, 4 of whom were Liberal appointments, 1 by Laurier and 3 by Mackenzie King. The 2 of them had been former MPs. Can you imagine what would have happened to Stephen Harper if he'd appointed 2 former Conservative MPs to the Supreme Court? This is back in the older days. But the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, women are not persons under Canadian law. And this case was pursued by what was called the Famous Five. These are 5 women in Alberta that all were members of populist parties, the farmers' parties and a couple of others. And they pushed this case beyond the Supreme Court. They took it to in those days, the Privy Council. You could appeal cases from the Canadian Supreme Court to the Privy Council in Britain. They appealed it to the Privy Council, and the Privy Council declared women to be persons in Canadian law. But this whole women's participation, that all came through populist parties and very much opposed by the establishment of the day. A third positive achievement, when the old Northwest Territories, like you remember there was the founding provinces of Canada, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And then there was this huge territory called the Northwest Territory. And the Laurier government decided to carve it up into 3 provinces and 2 territories, but very much against some of the wishes of Westerners who wanted it to stay as one big province to have equal weight in the federation with Quebec and Ontario. But when the federal government did that, it denied the control of natural resources to those provinces. It kept the control of those natural resources with the federal government, which made those provinces inferior to Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, which had provincial control of the natural resources. So for 25 years, there was this effort to transfer the control of natural resources to the provincial government, just like the other provinces had. And it was resisted by both Liberal and Conservative federal governments. Well, in 1930, they kept pushing on this. The United Farmers of Alberta, this again is a populist party, it was the government of Alberta at the time, pushed this hard again. And in those days, Mackenzie King had a minority in the federal parliament, and he was dependent on the support of a few of these progressives, the federal farm party. Those people said to King, if you don't go along with this transfer of natural resources to the provinces, we won't support you anymore. And that would have defeated the King government. So King agreed to it, and natural resource control was transferred to Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. It's the reason why oil royalties flow to Edmonton instead of to Ottawa. This is a huge accomplishment, and it's a constitutional change, which is very, very hard to get in this country. It was a constitutional change accomplished pushed by populist government in Alberta, made possible by populist members of the federal House. And then maybe the last one I'll mention is in Saskatchewan, in 1962, the CCF government there introduced the first universal health care system, basically the foundation of Medicare as we know it today, but it started in Saskatchewan. This is a populist government. The CCF was a bottom-up, it was on the left side center, but the Canadian Medicare was originally proposed and pushed by a populist party. So here, what I'm listening for here, these things can produce positive results if they're managed right, and if that wild side can be controlled. Now, I wanted to say something more about that. I guess a second thing that's sort of significant there is that is the difference between the initial reaction of the establishment and the traditional parties to these populist ideas and their eventual reaction to them, say 20, 25 years down the road. And in almost all these cases, these ideas that were pushed by these populist parties that were bitterly opposed by the establishment eventually were adopted by them. The Liberals were against women being in that federal parliament. They knocked Agnes Campbell McPhail out there. It was a Liberal court that said women weren't persons. But 30, 40 years later, the Liberal Party has become a champion of women's rights, the very thing that was opposed in the early day. When Medicare was instituted in Saskatchewan, it was bitterly fought by particularly the provincial Liberals, so with the help of the federal Liberals. They almost threatened a doctor's strike. But 30 years down the road, the Liberal Party, of course, champions Medicare. So ideas that were bitterly opposed when they started with this populist flavor, down the road became accepted by the traditional parties. On the conservative side, These farmers' parties were very strong advocates of free trade at a time that the federal Conservative Party was protectionist, the old national policy. And they bitterly resented these farmers' parties for advocating free trade, free trade, free trade all the time. But that changed over the years. The federal Conservative Party, which used to be called the Conservative Party of Canada, adopted the name Progressive Conservative. Progressive was not what it means today. They borrowed it from the Farmers' Party because they wanted to cut the progressives off at the pass. And guess which party actually negotiated the free trade agreement with the United States? It was a Conservative government that had fought free trade tooth and nail when it came. So the point I'm making is that while the establishment parties and may bitterly resent and oppose some of these populist ideas at the front end, if the ideas are right, eventually they not only come to be accepted, some of those same parties became champions of the very ideas that they opposed some time ago. Now, I want to flash forward to, and try and wind this up, because we're going to have a discussion here and a chance for you to ask questions, so I don't want to, one of the things politicians do is if you talk long enough, they won't have time to ask questions, but I won't pursue that strategy. But somebody's already asked me this, and this may be on your mind. Okay, let's flash forward to today. What would be a couple of the stirrings of this populist sentiment in Western Canada that if we're looking for what's significant that we should keep an eye on? I might use an analogy here, like forming and managing a populist party is a little bit like surfing. For one thing, if you want to surf, you can't. I've just been to Australia. I understand, and I'm a prairie boy, but I understand you can't surf if you stay on the land. Like you got to get in the water. You got to get where these things are. But in surfing, of course, you got this little surfboard, and you paddle out and you paddle out and you paddle out. And the idea is you look over your shoulder at the waves that are coming. And oh, here's a little one coming, but I don't think I can get up on it. Here's another one. Here's a bigger one coming. And I'm going to get up on it. And in a way, that's what these populist things are. As I mentioned, in the 1980s, we saw this wave come along, this wave of resentment on the National Energy Program, with this wave of resentment on the City of 18 decision. And we got this frail little board. We got no money, we got no nothing. But if we could get up on that wave, then we got all that energy, may be able to ride that a long way. We may drown, but we may get up on that board. So what are, I'm trying to use that analogy, what are the waves that are maybe coming along that some populist thing might get up on? Well, one of them is the frustrated regional expansion, or frustrated regional aspirations. The West has some aspirations. I wouldn't use the word alienation. That's the negative side of it. These are aspirations. These are positive aspirations. The West wants to be recognized as a distinctive region. It's as distinct in its way as Quebec is in it. It wants to be recognized as that. And it has these aspirations, specific ones, that it wants to have not only recognized, but have them addressed. It wants to see the natural resources sectors recognized as fundamental building blocks of the economy, not just the Western economy, the national economy, and treated as such. And by natural resource sectors, it means agriculture, energy, forestry, mining, and the fishery. And it points out to people, when you mention agriculture sector, energy sector, agriculture sector, people say, well, you're talking about the farmers and the ranchers in the West, and say, no, we're not talking about that. Yes, that's part of it. It's like a pyramid. There's farms and the producing sector. On top of that is an agriculture manufacturing sector, which is huge, much of which is in Ontario. There's an agriculture service sector on top of that. There's an agriculture knowledge sector on top of that. And for each of those resource sectors, that's the contributions of the resource sectors, if you take the whole, not just the bottom part, is immense to the entire country, not just to the West. And the West wants recognition of that. And they're furious that they can't find people in Ottawa that seem to understand that. So that can cause a wave. A second aspiration is this desire for unobstructed transportation corridors to the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Arctic, so that the inland provinces can get their stuff to Tidewater. in this recent convoy thing, you'll remember that these truckers obstructed the Ambassador Bridge at Windsor for a couple of days, and there was a huge outcry about it. The federal government said that this is almost a count to war. We've got to apply the Emergency Act. When American protesters particularly obstructed the CP mainland to the Pacific a number of months ago, a line over which 25 to 30% of the country's exports to the Pacific region, particularly from the West, when that was obstructed, Ottawa couldn't give a damn. In fact, they sided with the other side. So people said, we got this aspiration to be able to get to Tidewater, and we want it recognized, and we want to do it now. So that's a frustrated aspiration. If it's one of these waves that could get some traction. The other ones are this desire for domestic free trade. The West has always been strong on free trade, but we want the domestic free trade. So you've got this combination of aspirations, this desire for distinctiveness, the recognition of resource sectors, the unobstructed transportation corridors and free trade. You put those all together, and that's a pretty big wave. And if somebody gets a surfboard out there, they could ride that one a long way. So that's one to keep an eye on. It can be dealt with, as I've said, these things can be dealt with, but they have to be dealt with or that becomes a problem. But the other one, and I'll end on this one, the other potential wave is the one that was in a way represented by that freedom convoy, but it's a lot more than that. There is building up a resentment over the restrictions on the rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Charter that have been done in the name of health protection. Increasing resentment of that. And people saying, why can't there be balance? Why can't there be balance between health protection and protection of rights instead of all being on one side or the other? And there's an increasing resentment, not just in Western Canada, for the lockdown of the economy. That you can't lock, that has cost people jobs, it's cost hundreds of millions of dollars of income. The country won't recover that year. So those resentments over the restrictions on rights and freedoms and the conduct of economic lockdown without any impact assessment ever being done in advance of that's a wave that's coming. Those freedom convoy guys got onto that a little bit. It wasn't just about vaccine mandates for truckers, it was on these other things. I might ask you a question before you ask me one. There was $12.7 million raised through crowdfunding for that convoy thing before the government put an end to it and made them give the money back. Guess from which province the most of that money came? Anybody want to take a guess? Quebec. Ontario second. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick third. And the fourth part came from the West contributed, but it contributed more in kind, trucks, diesel fuel, and support services. What that tells you is that was a lot more than just about truckers. And it was a lot more than just about Alberta and or about the West. And if somebody builds a surfboard to get on top of that, you could ride that a long way. Now, so I'll close by, here's some questions then to ponder, and just ask you to think about these. First of all, with a historic appreciation, understanding of what populism is this bottom-up political force represented by the Freedom Convoy? I'll just take one of these waves. Is that a legitimate democratic protest against some of the government policies or not? Is it a legitimate democratic thing, what those people have done? Is it or is it not? And I think people have to make a decision on that, it's an evaluation. If it is not, like if you say, no, it's like it's not legitimate, or I don't like the scary parts of it, or I don't think it is a legitimate, I think it's an illegitimate political exercise. Then the question becomes, then what are you going to do to handle it? We've seen from the historical, if the response is to ignore it or just to disparage it, and if it's real, that just heaps fuel on the fire. So if it's not a legitimate democratic exercise, what to deal with it? Then the third question of that is, if it is legitimate, then what should be done to address the concerns that these people are raising? What should be done to get a better balance, at least in the future, between health protection and protection of rights and freedoms in the Constitution? What should be done to get a balance between health protection and economic sustainability? And those would be questions to think about. And as a minimum, one of the things I see developing is I think you're going to see increasing calls, not just from Western Canada, for a full-blown investigation, an independent investigation of how this COVID thing has been handled, that will maybe come up with some answers to these types of questions. But that's something for the future. So I think that's enough from me. You've been very patient listening to this story of populism, and we're now, I think, going to have a chat here, and then I look forward to answering your questions. Okay.
Thank you, Preston. Please have a seat.
Okay, thanks.
We also would like to welcome a friend of NLC, Karen Wells, who is going to engage Preston in conversation. And I think, Joel, do you want to do a bit of a sound check?
Yeah. All right, it's supposed to be on, is it? Test 2, 3. Yeah, it's on. All right, there we are.
Thank you
Good.
so much.
Good. Thank you, Betty. Thank you very much for all of that, Preston.
thank
Very grand to hear all of these things. Why so pronounced in the West? Because that is, as you said, where most of our populist movements have originated.
Well, I think it's partly because it's the younger, it is the younger part of the country, you know, in terms of historic development. And an awful lot of the people that came there, particularly the pioneers, they came for more freedom. Even in recent years, a lot of the immigrants come for more freedom, and the more political freedom you have to do whatever you want to do, the more it creates conditions where these populist things can get root. Whereas in more traditional parts of the country, it's a harder sell because, you know, the traditions are more established, they've been here longer, and so forth. I think it's the youthfulness and that pioneer spirit which is still there. And some of these industries lend themselves to that. Like the oil patch is a wild. You would talk about a wild patch. You go out and drill, you don't know what you're going to hit. It takes a certain type to engage in that activity. I think the combination of those things seem to create conditions where that is the case.
And in there too, is there an inherent distrust of federalism or of the kind of federation that we constructed?
Yeah, I think so. And that comes back to the unequal treatment. When Alberta and Saskatchewan were created, Manitoba was a little postage stamp province, and then it became bigger. When the federal Liberals, the Laurier Liberals came in, the West argument, and it was made by the best premier the old Northwest ever had, F.W.G. Haltane. He was in the same league as Laurier and MacDonald, if you read his stuff. And he argued that this territory should stay as one big region. He had a speech on big Westerners versus little Westerners. And then it would be able to be of equal weight in the federation. And of course that was denied. It was deliberately denied. It was denied mainly for political purposes. And so there's a suspicion the federal government's out to divide and conquer us, not to help us. So that's at the very beginning. And then when the federal government kept control of the natural resources, the West said, how is that fair? Nova Scotia has them, New Brunswick has them, Ontario has them, Quebec has them.
Why not us?
Why not us? So again, this feeds this resentment. And then in the Depression, of course, everybody was just stark mad at the world, but they blamed like R.B. Bennett was the federal government. The
Bennett buggy and all that stuff.
But it was the federal government. Why didn't they do anything to help us? Well, we'll throw them out and put these other guys in. But so there's about 3 or 4 of these major instances where it creates suspicion that the federal government's not on our side, it's our opponent. And this exists right now with respect to the Trudeau administration with respect to the energy sector. You've got this problem or challenge in Calgary. The oil patch has been under duress for the last 10 years, partly because of hostile government in Ottawa. For a while there was an NDP government in Edmonton, and the low price of oil. And so it's knocked out a whole bunch of companies, but the ones that are there now are lean and mean. and very good. Now that the price of oil is sky high, these guys are rolling in cash. There's hundreds of millions. What I'm getting to is what they're sitting there is deciding, what should we do with those hundreds of millions of dollars? Why would we put them in Canada? Why would we invest in here? The federal government says it doesn't. Well, there's all other kinds of places in the world. So again, it's another one of these cases of mistrust Ottawa, and it's going to fuel these two waves that I was talking about.
You've also got a growing environmental movement that is an absolute legitimate and not specifically political opposition to the oil patch.
Well, what the West says, let's get some balance on that. The world is currently consuming a little over 100 million barrels of oil a day. You're going to get the oil from somewhere. You want to get it from countries that don't give a damn about civil rights? You're going to get it from Venezuela, you look at their environmental record, or do you want to get it from people that are trying their darndest to do it in the most constructive way that you can? The second thing, when it comes to carbon taxes, I've been on this subject since 1970, and I put this out in the public audiences. I do this in the West. Okay, what's wrong with this logic? Every economic activity has environmental impacts. The economy is part of the environment. Some of those impacts are negative. We ought to identify those negative impacts. We ought to devise methods to avoid them or mitigate them. And we ought to include the cost of avoiding or mitigating those in the price of the product. Everybody agree with that? Okay, that's been done indirectly through a carbon tax on the energy sector. But if that principle applies to hydrocarbon energy, why doesn't it apply to hydro? Why doesn't it apply to nuclear? Why doesn't it apply to wind? And why doesn't it apply to solar? The hydro guys do not produce a lot of CO2, but they have flooded carbon sinks the size of Lake Ontario. So where's the reservoir tax if you're going to treat them all fairly? The nuclear guys don't produce a lot of CO2, although they use an awful lot of concrete, but they produce one of the deadliest poisons known to man, on which billions of dollars has to be spent. Where's the radiation tax for the nuclear guy? If you're going to use a tax system to internalize the environmental externalities, do it for all. And again, so this plays into how come it's just that and not the other sources. So I think that there's a lot of support for environmental protection, even in the oil patch. Everything you can do conceivably to get it done, but it's not seen as being fairly applied.
I have a feeling we'll get questions on this from the audience, and we'll let that happen in a minute. I know that you're not particularly enthusiastic about identity politics.
No.
Doesn't populism and the distress of a particular group of people amount to identity politics?
Well, it depends what the composition of the group is.
Right, but if you're saying the West wants in, it's we who live in Alberta. That's how we identify.
That's the regional, yes, there is this regional identity. Well, I'd ask this in two cases. One is look at the composition of these populist groups. They're not nearly as narrow as some of the political groups that are on the identity side. Not nearly. Even if you look at that freedom convoy. One of the reasons the federal government got upset about that was that politically they've lost most of the West, so they don't worry about that. It was these Quebec truckers that showed up. That starts to hit in the constituency that they worry. I was trying to think what on the other side of this. On this regional thing, I'm glad you brought that up. What I've been saying to these federal conservative friends, including these people that want to be leaders, when O'Toole was the leader, the Western MPs for conservatism, this gets into this regionalism, tried to say you got to have a stronger planks in your platform to address this Western aspirations or alienation, or you're going to lose. You're not going to lose at any party here. These people are going to stay home, and you're going to lose seats that way. So can you not strengthen the pushback from him and the people around him? More the people around him says, if we address Western alienation, we're going to alienate people in other parts of the country, which is kind of getting at what you're, if we favor one group, we're going to alienate the others. So what I've been saying to the party is, why doesn't one of these federal parties, I prefer the Conservative Party, but I don't care why don't one of them declare that they will officially recognize the regional character of Canada? This is a country of regions. There's an Atlantic region, there's a distinct Quebec region, there's a Laurentian region, there's an Ontario region, there's a Prairie region.
Which is what makes it difficult to govern.
Well, exactly, but this is getting to how to do that. Why don't you recognize them all and say, each of you has unique and distinct aspirations, every one of you, and you can name them. And we're going to address all of those, so that when we address Quebec's distinctiveness, or whether we address Western alienation, it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. No, we're going to do them all. And the price of us dealing with your alienation is you being cooperative on what we're doing with the others. Like, I think you could unite the country on that by recognizing the region, but dealing with it in that way.
Quebec has history on its side that the West and the other regions cannot claim in the same way. I mean,
but why claim it? And as I mentioned, the soft nationalism, a distinction of Quebec, but populism is an equal political, cultural and political distinction of the West. So why not recognize them both? And why not say that one is inferior to the other? And not just the West, Atlantic Canada. Atlantic Canada just languishes. It's got its own set of issues that you hardly even hear on the federal scene. I think one of the ways of uniting the country is to recognize these regional dimensions and say we're going to tackle the major unique aspirations of each. But that way, when we address yours or we address yours, you're not going to stick out like a sore thumb. And our condition for doing that is we're going to address yours, but you cooperate when we address. It's the whole deal model of Confederation. You people like stories. That's getting off, but equalization has been a huge fight in the country. But my father, who was Premier of Alberta for a long time, he went to the first federal provincial conference after the war in which equalization, it wasn't called that, but it was discussed. And it was discussed that the premiers and the prime minister get together in these formal meetings, nothing happens, nobody agrees, but they go to the prime minister's house at night at Kingsmere, where King was living, and it's a well lubricated event. My father didn't drink, so he was one.
Must have been very bored. Yeah,
he was the sober one. But anyway, he said at that meeting, King started to go around the room. What do you want? And point to this premier. Like, what do you? And he's really talking about dollars. How much do you want to get out of this? But then he would ask the second question, and what are you prepared to give up in order to get it? And he went around the whole room that way. And my father says he thinks the next day King calls in his deputy finance minister, or the finance minister, says, come up with a formula that gives him 30 million, him 25, him 15. And oh, by the way, figure out a kind of a rationalization for it called the equalization.
That's how it was
born.
And
my father's point was the deal came first and the formula came second. And in what we're talking about here, even in this, the deal, I want this, and I'm prepared to give this up so that you can get that. That deal,
it is a negotiated deal.
Yeah, that deal has to precede any, and then I don't know what you want to call it, the recognizing the regional character of Canada. That's the rhetoric on top, but the deal is at the, and I think the country needs a prime minister, like MacDonald. MacDonald was very, very good at that. The country wouldn't exist. He got that deal, and I think we need leadership that can get that kind of deal. Anyway, that's a diversion from your script.
And I've been thinking about the kind of populism that you've been discussing, which rises up from the grassroots. Yeah. There has developed a rather exploitive use of the term, I'm thinking. How do you counter that? And there's one thing that's on my mind at the moment. As you know, we're in the middle of a provincial election, or on the verge of. And the Ontario Party announced 3 days ago that it was bringing in as their senior strategic advisor, Roger Stone, who, as we all know, Donald Trump pardoned, etc. And that label populism will be used, that you should support this party because it is populist, it comes from the base. And yet you have this man who has been called many things, you know, a mendacious windbag is one of them. And that's one of the more polite. But how do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is the more the public themselves understand what this phenomenon is really about, so that when there's phony aspects of it, they can pick that up. And so I think there's something the public and the media can do to help educate people about this, so that they're not susceptible to these extraneous things. And then the second thing is for these populist parties to watch out for that themselves and recognize that you do that, you'll discredit the concept rather than benefit. One of the things the public got to watch is that there are some very clever political consultants out there that will work for any party, and whatever your objective is, they'll help you get it. And what these guys say, for example, is if your opponent, if you're a government and your opponents organize a protest against you, there's three ways you can deal with that. One is to ignore it. The second is to organize a kind of a counter protest from your own supporters and followers and media. The third way is to infiltrate the populist movement with discreditable people. Send the guy in there with a swastika. Send the guy in there that will hurl obscenities at the media, and if you watch those groups, in the back there's a guy saying, go over there because that's where the camera is. That is a tactic that is
Widely used.
Widely, and so I think, again, the public has to take with a grain of salt some of these things that you see. They may be genuine and something to worry about. They may be things planted by the other side. It's discouraging, because these are people that are taking the freedoms, you know, they're taking the freedoms that we have to say what we want, to do what we want, and turning it against the very system that creates those freedoms. You know?
Which increases the disillusionment.
Yes, yeah. Particularly among, I'm glad to see younger people here tonight. I've got emails from young people saying that I don't feel at home in this country anymore, and I'm going somewhere else. That's very disturbing to. We had this Manning Center in Calgary where we noticed with millennials particularly saying, we don't buy the old center, left, right context in which you old guys insist, and in the media too, insist on talking about. Why are we talking about center, left, right, which comes from the seating arrangements after the French Revolution? This is a little bit time to put that up. So we put on these receptions for millennials that are centered there. We said, well, are there some other axes that you could relate to more? And we had these on posters around, and when they came in, we give them a sticker, where would you be on this axis, this axis? We had a democratic axis. Do you like these bottom-up large numbers of people participating in the referendum and stuff, or do you prefer more expert opinion and stuff like that coming the other way? Where are you on that axis? We had an environmental one. Do you favor environmental protection through basically government actions, regulations, or laws, or do you think markets and entrepreneurship and private capital can be behind? Where are you on that? We had about 15 of these, and we found that there was a lot more willingness to identify with those axes, where if you put up the left, right, center, people that said, I don't want it.
But how do you pull it together? I mean, I'm not picking on the Green Party, but the Green Party is clearly environmentally keen. What happens if you don't like their financial policy, their fiscal policy? I mean, you've got to vote for someone.
Well, I think in the end you say we'll support the one that can put it together. We had these 15, and then we'd say, okay, if you could only have 3 of these, what would they be? Like, we tried to narrow it down and say, if you're just going to crusade on one of these, you can join a special interest group or an advocacy group, but you're not a political party, and you're not a governing party. You're governing, you got to cover it all. So I'd say to people, position yourself on these particular things that are concerned to you, but at the end of the day, in answering your question, which party has got this best together? I think that there's this old joke about why the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle. And I think there's a balance. I'm not talking about an unprincipled middle between the environment and the economy. I think there's a balanced position, that our political parties should. What's the balance between these polarizing extremes? Because we're getting there's just extremes and no balanced position. And the one that can come up with the best balance would be the one that I would commend.
I know it's nearly time to wrap up. I want to ask you one other question. when you talk about populism, you talk about it's a vehicle to re-engage the population because they have become disillusioned, and the populism is an articulation of that disillusionment. Is there anything that can remedy that disillusionment in things like more direct democracy, town halls, plebiscites? The Americans do a lot of, and they're not called plebiscites, and I can't remember what they're called, particularly in the Western states. How much use is that, if you like?
Well, I just take one exception to the way you put that. You say you try to engage these people. Populism, they are engaged.
I take your
question
point.
now for them is how can that be directed positively? But well, one of the characteristics on the Democratic front of all these movements is a greater interest in direct democracy measures. All those populist parties, the Progressives, the Farmers Party, Social Credit, CCF, all favored use of referendum, citizens' initiatives, recall, even recall, and so I think there's some merit in using those mechanisms as another way for people to express themselves. And one of the things for reform, it was just a godsend to us, as you remember, in 1992, was that when there was a referendum on the Charlottetown Accord? Yeah, it was the year before the 93 election. All the things you have to do in a referendum campaign are almost the same as what you have to do in an election campaign. You got to knock on doors, you got to give speeches, you got to talk to the media and so forth. And we had this raw party with not much experience doing anything, but we participated very heavily in that referendum campaign, which was an enormous preparation for the election campaigns. So some of these direct democracy measures do feed into more vigorous participation in the electoral system. But all of these things today with these the social media people, the artificial intelligence people, it's pretty easy to corrupt a referendum campaign, to corrupt a recall petition. You know, I don't know.
Anything can be played with.
Yeah.
I've got one last quick question for you. What's going to happen on May the 11th when the leadership review comes back in Alberta?
Well, I don't know.
Oh, Mr. Innocent.
They're voting on a secret ballot?
Yes, indeed. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think the government is in real difficulty there. I really, and the premier is. I know the premier fairly well. I recruited him. Jason Kenney's dad was the principal of the Notre Dame College in Wilcox, Saskatchewan. Remember that Father Murray, the hockey guy came from?
Hockey.
And we had a meeting in somewhere close to Wilcox, and Jason and his dad came to that, and he eventually joined the Reform Party. I recruited him, and he ran for us in Calgary Southeast, riding next to me. So I've known him for a long time. But he's got some real difficulties there, and I'm not sure how it's going to turn out.
Everybody will stay tuned, I'm sure.
Yes.
All right, that's enough from me. Now,
Hi, audience, it's your turn, and it's 8:30 now. This was such a fantastic presentation that we want to go over, and we hope that our Zoom audience doesn't mind sticking around for a little while longer. So people, there's a microphone there for you. Come line up and speak your question. We've got some wipes there if you want to sanitize the mic, but please come on up and ask Mr. Manning what it is you want to know.
here comes a person.
It's hard for us to see you, so we're squinting. Yeah, okay, we can see you at the front. Yeah.
Hey. The value and the function of the Senate in Canada has been in question for decades at this point. How do you think the Senate can be reformed to include the West's view and decrease the development of these rogue wells and act as those relief wells?
You're basically asking about the Senate in relation to the Senate?
Yeah, so how can it be reformed to?
Well, we were on this theme of the Triple E Senate. We wanted to see the Senate elected with equal representation from each province and an effective role in the federal parliament. We felt it wasn't effective because it wasn't directly accountable to the electorate. Of course, this has been argued for years, and basically what the courts have said is you can't change the composition of it without a constitutional amendment. And the courts have said you can't even democratize the place without a constitutional amendment. So it's extremely hard to get these reforms because you got all the provinces that benefit from now, which are the majority of the provinces, will not support the constitutional amendment to change it. I do think the one reform you could still get there is to democratize the place better. We've had these Senate elections where the Senate is, the appointee is elected. That would at least move one step towards making the place more democratic. But that's probably about the only reform you can get until you get a constitutional amendment, and it's virtually impossible to get it.
Right, thank you.
I could tell you lots of jokes about the Senate, but they're impolite.
Come on up, please.
Hi there, my name is Luke. I'm from Trinity College School. I'm one of the young people you were talking about before. So in 1997, by splitting the Conservative vote in half, you gave the Liberals 3 consecutive majorities. And the type of populism we have now is not as popular as it used to be, but we see that some political figures on the right, such as like Pierre Poilievre, Maxime Bernier, are gaining traction with their populist ideals. Do you think the PPC will do the same thing and split the Conservative vote and give the Liberals an even more power than they already have?
Well, there's always this danger if you get more parties, you split the vote. I don't think the PPC is much a threat on that. I think the bigger threat to the Conservatives is if nobody is seen to be addressing some of these things that I mentioned, particularly this regional aspirations. The biggest threat is not from other parties, but from hundreds of thousands of people staying home. And I think that's the biggest thing that whoever the new leader of the Conservative Party's got to worry about. We were there. It is true that reform split the vote, but our aim was to eventually get to a Conservative majority, and by golly, it happened. The elections you mentioned, it was split, but eventually you got a minority government and you got a majority government. And this ought to, I don't divert from this, but this ought to be encouraging to you young people. Nobody's been more critical of democracy in Canada than me. I think it's a lot of defective, but 5 people were able to take the tools that democracy gives you, freedom of speech, freedom, try to persuade people to do this and that, and by golly, it went from 52 seats to 60 seats to 66 seats to a minority government to a majority government. There's a potential for democratic change here that you don't find in many other countries. So on the Constitution point, I think that's. I'll tell you my Constitution vote joke. There was a constitutional lawyer who spent his entire life working on the Canadian Constitution. He died and went to heaven. And Peter said, when new people come here, they get to ask God one important question. So he says, the constitutional lawyer says, well, will Canada's constitutional dilemmas ever be resolved? So Peter goes away, he comes back, he says, God says 2 things to you. One is, yes, they will be resolved, but not in his lifetime. On that encouraging note.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Betty, are you telling us we're done?
No, when this young man finishes, I have a question from the Zoom audience. that I'd
Good.
like to ask.
Sure. I actually just want to touch on one more point
Yeah.
that you actually made in the speech. You said, like, with the carbon taxing the oil sector, we should actually tax like hydro, wind, solar, and nuclear. But why would we do that? The amount of harm that the oil and gas sector produces to our environment is very large compared to the minimal effect that, say, nuclear has, or hydro, or wind and solar. So why would we put forth more taxes for the industries that are trying to gain traction right now, whereas the oil sector, we are trying to mitigate the amount of pollution that they produce into the air?
Well, two reasons. One is there are other environmental concerns to be worried about besides greenhouse gases. There are other things to be worried about, and what I'm talking about addresses them all rather than just one. Our family has a small ranching operation. We were down in the Cypress Hills in the southeast corner of Alberta. There's some of the last fescue buffalo grass that you'll find in the country. There is a proposal to build 84 wind towers along there. There has to be a road into the base of each tower because they have to service it. You drive a truck across that fescue 3 times, the next year there is invasive species in the tire tracks, and you'll destroy one of the most important, natural resources of that area. So there are other, I'm not saying that greenhouse gases aren't a problem, but there are these other ones. The second argument is just a conceptual one, a framework. If you go along with this idea, we should internalize the negative environmental consequences of producing energy, however we produce it, and have the people that are using that energy pay for that internalization. You ought to do that for all of them, or else your pricing system is giving the wrong signals. It's saying it's giving a much cheaper price signal for the ones where you don't internalize it, and a higher one for the ones that you do. You're distorting the market, and you'll distort the energy use. So I'd say there's sort of 2 reasons for. I'm not diminishing the importance of mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions, but I think you should do it fairly. And I think there are other consequences that one has to worry about, particularly your generation. Ours won't be around.
That's true.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, this question comes from our Zoom audience. Preston talked about how one of the ways you can release pressure is to have logical, reasonable people within the movement to level out the extremes. Do you think the populist movement associated with the Freedom Convoy and the Freedom Fighters of Canada are already too far in the radical ideologies to have lasting positive impacts that the former populist movements you mentioned have given, or is it on the path to being destructive and divisive?
Well, if that person were here, I would ask him, and I'd ask him politely, what do you know about this Freedom Convoy? Where did you find that out? How many independent truckers do you know and have talked to on this? And it may be that they would still give that answer because, I've talked to them and they're wild men. But I would question whether that person's been in a position to actually understand what that thing was about. Yes, there's these wild elements. There's an awful lot of responsible people connected to it as well. And I think that's just a general answer to these questions. You cannot count on what you get from the media or even the politicians on these subjects. You almost have to go to source. I regret saying that. I regret saying it from the political class, and you would regret it from the standpoint. But you almost have to go to source if you really want to answer that question. You find out for yourself how radical they are, and or how sane they are, or what the mix is.
Can I follow up on that?
Yep.
Because I know in your book you talk about, having to bear the consequences. If you embark upon an action, if you go too far and break the law, you do then have to own up to it, as it were. So the Freedom Convoy got to a point where there was a lot of concern. There were a lot of children there. Property was destroyed. And I take your point that you can't always believe what you see. But what happens when you get to that point? Surely there has to be action.
Well, I think there should be a discussion of that question. But if you talk to those guys about that, say, how come if we break the law on the vaccine mandates, the Prime Minister is the only ethics commissioner said he broke the conflict of interest law in 4 places. How come the RCMP didn't knock on his door, they knocked on mine? Hard to say.
That's a tit for tat argument.
No, but what there's, and my father used to, one of the things, he was in legislature for 33 years, he's premier for 25 years. He used to say to his guys every year, those of us who make the laws and those of us who administer the laws had better keep the laws or we lose our moral authority to govern. And that's partly what happened in that. They say, yeah, okay, we're breaking this regulation, but these guys are breaking, they believe they're breaking the Constitution. They don't think they have the constitutional power to do that, and these other instances. So this gets into an argument, but that's how some of them would respond.
So therefore, actions like property destruction are justified?
No, but even on that, the mayor of Ottawa, and I could get uncomplimentary about this, but the mayor and the police chief had a press conference and said this convoys has cost this city $35 million in prepare. You know what those truckers would say to that, or what the transport association? The decisions made in this city by the federal government have cost the transportation industry, and that's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And you don't object to that? You don't have a press conference concerned about that? You're concerned about this?
But does that entitle an opposing action?
Well, I think it provides a justification for it. Yeah, I think it provides a justification. And then it forces this discussion. Okay, you stop breaking the law and we'll stop breaking
But
the
it
law.
wouldn't provide a defense in court.
Well, I think we're yet to see how defended the bridges of the charter. I think this has not got to the Supreme Court. How come this has not got to the Supreme Court? You got the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, millions of people's rights have been violated. It's been dealt with at the lower courts, it hasn't got to the Supreme Court.
It takes a while to get to the Supreme
No,
Court.
but it takes a lot of money to go to the Supreme Court.
Absolutely, but they're bound to be pro
We'll take a
bono
collection
lawyers.
after this. Yeah.
Anyway.
No, these are very good points, and they got to be debated. Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody else has a, so
We
no
have
woman
no
who
more
has a
questions.
question?
We have, someone's coming down. Okay, we'll do one more question, and then remember, Preston will be back tomorrow in Coburg, so we can talk then.
Yeah.
Mr. Manning, thank you very much for your comments tonight. I used to live in Alberta. I was a roughneck
Okay.
for a couple of summers while
Yeah.
I was at the U of A. My question, for somebody who lived in Alberta and who sees the frustration of here we have, I don't know if Alberta could claim to supply all of Canada with its energy needs, but certainly it was just so frustrating to see Energy East pipeline gone. And so here we are, a case where regionalism trumped national interest. Why does this happen in Canada so much?
It's hard to understand. Why can't we build these pipelines? Is that what you're basically asking?
Pipelines or any large, seems to be large-scale project in Canada.
Yeah, well,
Of the national interest. And you know, you read in the Globe and Mail where in other places where foreign investors are saying Canada is not a reputable place,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
dependable, maybe dependable, I don't know what the right word to use is, because it's so regulated, or it's hard to navigate to actually get business done.
no, yeah, well, I wish I had the answer to that. This inability to provide this. In Calgary, we live on the Bull River there, and the old original CP line goes across on the other side of the river there. We call them Trudeau trains. There's these tank cars, 100, 200 tank cars. There's all kinds of science that says the best way to move large volumes of oil, large distances, is by pipeline. That's why they were invented. It is not to move it by, but here this country is moving oil by they're going through the mountains with those 200 car trains. They're going to have a Lac-Mégantic thing one of these days. But it comes down to the current government is opposed to the continued expansion of the petroleum sector, and they're going to oppose that until they're replaced or change their minds. There's no satisfactory answer to that question other than a political one.
Probably not. Somebody's trying to sneak in under the wire here.
Well, I think he should be. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering, in your opinion, why the Conservative Party hasn't been able to beat the Trudeau government in the past 2 elections?
That's a good question.
That's a good question, yeah. I think they would like to know that. Well, part of it is they've actually got more votes than the Liberals in the last 2 elections, but the votes are more, huge majorities in the Western ridings and not enough in the other parts of the country. So
Does that mean the Conservatives would endorse proportional representation?
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either.
No.
Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, that's a good. But I think basically they've got. I say the country's divided, but I say a party that wants to unite it has got to prove it can unite itself first. So I think one of the weaknesses is some of the internal divisions, and if those can be resolved and reconciled, then it'll have a better chance. And if one of these waves comes along, and particularly if it's not just confined to Western Canada, whichever party can build the platform that is the surfboard to pick up on those waves will do very well. And this is you can't answer that question right now tonight, but I'd keep an eye on that. Who can harness those bottom-up forces and use them to win seats in the federal election? If the Conservatives can do it, they can win. Yeah.
Before we convene, can I ask one question?
Sure.
Is the adage true?
You're in
that
charge.
If the Conservative, if you can win the leadership of the Conservative Party, you can't win the leadership of the country? Is that still true?
No, because Stephen Harper won the leadership of the party.
I shouldn't say is that still true. Is that true now?
I think, again, it depends who it is and how they conduct themselves, but, and I still think there's a possibility of that, yeah.
And are you going to give us any idea of who you think will win the leadership?
Oh, no, I'm giving advice to all of them.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you very much. This has been a most educational evening. Thank you, Preston, for helping us understand what populism is and how it can be both a challenge and an opportunity. So this wraps up our presentation for the evening, and as I said, Preston will be back tomorrow in Cobourg at the Columbus Community Center on Spencer Street, and I think he will focus more on Wexit.
Yeah, and we'll hang around a little bit tonight too,
Okay,
if
great.
there's
You'll
somebody
hang around
that hasn't.
tonight, too. That's tomorrow at 10 a.m. So if you haven't had a chance to ask your question, you can come again tomorrow and speak to him. Before we let some personal conversations happen after we shut off the Zoom part of the meeting, I just want to say a few words about our speaker next week. Maybe speaker is the wrong word. Raconteur might be a better description. BJ Smith is a cowboy and a comedian. Next Thursday, he'll tell us why horses never put a foot wrong. And on Friday, we're in for an evening of fun at the Capitol Theatre in Port Hope. BJ is here in the audience tonight.
Where is he?
He'll stand up, I think, and say hello to all. A friend of Mr. Manning as well. So look forward to seeing many people there next week. But once again, I want to focus on Preston Manning, who came all the way from Alberta, sort of via Australia, to be here. 2 years ago, we invited him, and he didn't give up on us. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Karen. Good night.
Thank you.